Welcome to Lesson 8 of the Gospel of Luke. Today we're going to be talking about some other things that are part of Jesus' ministry, some perhaps that maybe you haven't heard before, and others that are quite familiar. So before we get started, could we bow for a word of prayer? Father, we are living in some strange times, Lord. And I suppose that if we really think about it carefully, maybe Jesus was living in some strange times as well. But they're exciting times for us, because this world, it seems like it's heading in some directions that maybe we're not excited about, maybe you're not excited about. But Father, as always, we know from your word, the story that we've been looking at, just a piece of it, but in your word, your story, you tell us that you're in control. And you also basically make promises that you always keep. So Father, it's comforting to know that as crazy as things are, you're in control of things. So we give you thanks and praise, and thank you for being part of this series that we're studying here in Luke, and guide us and direct us through this particular lesson right now. In Jesus' name, amen. So, let's take a look in our textbook, and we're going to read, as usual, from the introduction and commentary right in the beginning here on page 70. And it begins here. Apparently, there was no love lost between George Bernard Shaw and Winston Churchill. On one occasion, Shaw sent Churchill 2 theater tickets with the note, "I am enclosing 2 tickets to the first night of my new play. Bring a friend, if you have one." Such animosity has often existed not only between individuals but also between races. For example, the Jews and the Samaritans held centuries-old hatred for one another. But Jesus opposed hatred and prejudice. He told a pious Jew a story about a good Samaritan who rescued a severely wounded traveler at great personal cost. The Samaritan truly obeyed the law to love his neighbor as himself. This study challenges our love for our neighbor. The commentary then goes on to say, the scriptures for this study introduce a new phase of Jesus' earthly ministry. Except for occasional visits to Jerusalem to attend feasts, and the first 2 years of Jesus' ministry were spent in and around Galilee. Very early before he began his public ministry, he went to Bethabara, east of the Jordan River, to be baptized by John the Baptist, and was then immediately led by the Spirit into the wilderness of Judea, where he was tempted by the devil. He returned to Galilee, where he began his public ministry. Soon thereafter, John recorded that he made the trip to Jerusalem for the Passover, cleansed the temple of money changers for the first time, had the encounter with Nicodemus, and got the attention of the Pharisees, who heard that Jesus' disciples were baptizing more people than John. Apparently, Jesus didn't feel it was right to oppose the Pharisees so early in his ministry, so he went back to Galilee for almost 2 years of that ministry. So, we're talking about some things that are going on here somewhat in the beginning of his ministry, and that leads us into the questions that we have for today. But before we do that, of course, we need to read from the Word. So we want to take a look here, first of all, in Luke. We want to do chapter 9, 13 through 36 is where we're going to start, and then we're going to take another passage from chapter 9. So, reading from the NIV version, and we're reading, as I said, 18 to 36. Once when Jesus was praying in private and his disciples were with him, he asked them, "Who do the crowd say I am?" They replied, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others that one of the prophets of long ago that has come back to life." But then Jesus says, "But what about you?" He asked, "Who do you say I am?" Peter answered, "God's Messiah." Jesus strictly warned them not to tell this to anyone, and he said, "The Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and he must be killed, and on the third day be raised to life." Then he said to all of them, "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross daily and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me will save it. What good is it for someone to gain the whole world and yet lose or forfeit their very self? Whoever is ashamed of me and my words, the Son of Man will be ashamed of them when he comes in his glory and in the glory of the Father and of the holy angels. Truly I tell you, some who are standing here will not taste death before they see the kingdom of God." About 8 days after Jesus said this, he took Peter, John, and James with him and went up into the mountain to pray. As he was praying, the appearance of his face changed, and his clothes became as bright as a flash of lightning. 2 men, Moses and Elijah, appeared in glorious splendor, talking with Jesus. They spoke about his departure, which he was about to bring to fulfillment at Jerusalem. Peter and his companions were very sleepy, but when they became fully awake, they saw his glory and the 2 men standing with him. As the men were leaving, Peter said to him, "Master, it is good for us to be here. Let us put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." While he was speaking, a cloud appeared and covered them, and they were afraid as they entered the cloud. A voice came from the cloud saying, "This is my son, whom I have chosen. Listen to him." When the voice had spoken, they found that Jesus was alone. The disciples kept this to themselves and did not tell anyone at that time what they had seen. So we have a couple things going on here. And of course, the first one, and these are actually not really going to be discussed in the questions. The next reading will take place and that we will do actually focuses on those questions. But these are some important things that I just thought we needed to at least look at. And Peter, first of all, Jesus is trying to find out what the crowds are saying. Who do you say that? Who do they say I am? And well, they gave him an answer. John the Baptist. Some think that it's Elijah come back. Some other prophet that has returned. But finally he says, "You know what? I don't care so much what they are saying. I want to know, what do you say? Who do you say I am?" And of course, as many times was the case, Peter seemed to be the spokesman for the group. And he's the one that came up with the answer. Who do you say I am? God's Messiah. So, obviously at this point in time, they're starting to realize who they're dealing with. There are many things that, took place that it says in the Word that the disciples didn't understand. Jesus would say things, and I don't know if they were afraid to ask or what it might be, but on numerous occasions he talked about his death, and they didn't have any clue of what he was talking about. So they now are starting to realize that this is the Messiah that was spoken of long, long ago. Now, he warned them. He said, "Do not tell this to anyone." And then he goes on to talk about that he is going to die, but he doesn't come right out and really say it as clearly as maybe we would need to hear to understand it. But whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross daily and follow me. So he's talking and he's going to predict his death here. And then this story of the transfiguration. It doesn't get talked about much, and they didn't choose to use this in our questions, but the transfiguration was this, well, it happened. Jesus took 3 of his disciples up on a mountain, and they witnessed this transformation. Now, it did say that they were somewhat sleepy. Seems like that's the case here on several occasions. Garden of Gethsemane as well later on. But when they were fully awake, they realized that Jesus was there with Moses and Elijah. And so Another story that I thought maybe we should at least mention before we get into the ones that we're focusing on today. So we want to turn to actually verse 51 in chapter 9. And this will be the passage that some of the questions are going to be focusing on. As the time approached for him to be taken up to heaven, Jesus resolutely set out for Jerusalem. And he sent messengers on ahead who went into a Samaritan village to get things ready for him. But the people there did not welcome him because he was heading for Jerusalem. When the disciples James and John saw this, they asked, "Lord, do you want us to call fire down from heaven to destroy them?" But Jesus turned and rebuked them. Then he and his disciples went to another village. Now, I don't want to get into too much here because we'll be discussing this with the questions and the commentary. But this is a little story here that, well, it isn't as familiar as some. And if we go to question number 1, the one that always asks about what was something that was new that you'd never considered before, and my answer to that is, I don't ever remember this story from Luke from past studies. It doesn't really paint a pretty picture of James and John. If we take a look, I wanted to focus back on Luke 9, 1-6. And here it says, when Jesus had called the 12 together, he gave them power and authority to drive out all demons and to cure diseases. He sent them out to proclaim the kingdom of God and to heal the sick. He told them, "Take nothing for the journey, no staff, no bag, no bread, no money, no shirt. Whatever house you enter, stay there until you leave that town. If people do not welcome you, leave their town and shake dust off your feet as a testimony against them." So they went out from village to village, proclaiming the good news and healing people everywhere. Now, the reason I bring up that particular passage is, what did Jesus say if you were not welcomed in a village as you're going out to preach the news? Well, shake the dust off your shoes, okay, and then leave the village. Never said anything about, as what we read here in 51 through 55, which basically, do you want us to call fire down from heaven to destroy them? Not quite what Jesus had told them back as he sent them out for the very first missionary journey, if you might call it that. So let's look into this a little bit further. It started out in the very first verses here in 51, as the time approached for him to be taken up to heaven. So what are we talking about here? Well, obviously Jesus knew what was coming. And at some point in time, he was going to have to die, be resurrected, and return to heaven. So his ministry was really more on the outbound part of the ministry. And so he's now heading to Jerusalem. I think in the commentary it indicated that Jesus sort of started out his ministry and then determined that maybe he wasn't welcome in Jerusalem. I guess he didn't really want to deal with the Pharisees any further, and so he spent the next 2 years in the Galilee. So now he's ready to move back toward Jerusalem. And it goes on to say then in the next verse, he resolutely set out for Jerusalem. He wasn't going to be persuaded to turn back, that it wasn't safe. He set out knowing what was ahead of him. So let's see what so the question says, why would Jesus resolutely set out for Jerusalem, knowing his life would be in danger there? The text on page 71 does start out talking a little bit about this trip. Before it does, it says, on the trip from Jerusalem to Galilee. Now this was way back in the beginning of the ministry, so let's not get confused here. On the trip from Jerusalem to Galilee, Jesus had his first recorded encounter with the Samaritans at a town called Sychar. His interaction with the Samaritan woman at the well and the openness of the people of Sychar to his message stand in stark contrast to the way he and his disciples were received 2 years later when he left Galilee to go back to Jerusalem to begin his Judean ministry. So, in the beginning of his ministry, when he went from Jerusalem to Galilee, he went through Samaria, met the woman at the well. Great story there. And he was well received throughout all of Samaria. But things changed as he was heading back from Galilee to Jerusalem. Jesus had chosen to travel through Samaria rather than take the longer route east of the Jordan south to Jerusalem in order to avoid Samaria. He sent some of his people on ahead to arrange food and lodging, presumably James and John, but they ran into trouble. The people there did not welcome him because he was heading for Jerusalem, and herein lies a long story. So let's take a look at what that story might be that might help us understand. It says, when King Solomon died, his son Rehoboam became king. The northern tribes refused to accept him as king, and they crowned Jeroboam instead. War ensued, but Rehoboam was not able to retain control over the northern tribes. The kingdom was divided into two parts. The northern kingdom became known as Israel, with its capital in Samaria, and the southern kingdom became Judah, with Jerusalem as its capital. Yet, in spite of the division, even the northern tribes still looked to Jerusalem as the holy city and sought to return there often to worship. The Assyrians conquered Samaria in 721 BC and took many of its inhabitants into captivity. The king of Assyria then resettled the kingdom with many nationalities and religions. Religious mayhem ensued. The result was that they worshiped the Lord, but they also served their own gods in accordance with the customs of the nations from which they had been brought. When the Jews returned to Jerusalem after the Babylonian-Persian captivity, they refused to allow the Samaritans to help them rebuild the temple. The old antagonism between North and South developed into open enmity between the two groups. The Samaritans built a rival temple on Mount Gerizim and declared the 5 books of Moses as the only scriptures and Moses as the only prophet. Animosity was deep and abiding and was still a problem in the days of Jesus' ministry. At the time of the verses for this study, Samaria was a territory with nebulous boundaries between Galilee and Judea. And even though it made the trip longer and more arduous, Jews traveling between Galilee and Judea usually took the longer route east of the Jordan rather than travel through Samaria. And the Samaritans made it very difficult for any Jews traveling through their territory toward Jerusalem. So, just to summarize, there has always been this enmity between Israel and Jerusalem, and basically this area now was known as Samaria, and it's all because of the captivity. And when the Assyrians overtook Jerusalem, and Israel, they took all these captives back to their country and settled in various areas, and so the people of Samaria were living in a land they introduced many different religions, and so the Jewish people from Judea, basically, when they finally were allowed to come back to Jerusalem and repopulate this area, they looked upon them with disdain because they obviously were not, in their minds, true Jews, because they were possibly worshiping other gods other than Jehovah. So it's been, a problem, and so many times the Jews didn't want to travel through that land because it was such a difficult journey made difficult by the Samaritans. So they went to the east side of the Jordan River, which actually was outside of their territory. Now, we have one other thing here that we want to add to that, and this comes from Barclay, actually. And what he says here is, the direct way from Galilee to Jerusalem led through Samaria, but most Jews avoided it. There was a century-old quarrel between the Jews and the Samaritans. The Samaritans, in fact, did everything they could to hinder and even to injure any band of pilgrims who attempted to pass through their territory. For Jesus to take that way to Jerusalem was unusual, and to attempt to find hospitality at a Samaritan village was still more unusual. When he did this, he was extending a hand of friendship to a people who were enemies. In this case, not only was hospitality refused, but the offer of friendship was spurned. No doubt, therefore, James and John believed that they were doing a praiseworthy thing when they offered to call in divine aid to blot out the village, but Jesus would not permit them. There is no passage in which Jesus so directly teaches the duty of tolerance as in this passage. In many ways, tolerance is a lost virtue, and often where it does exist, it exists from the wrong cause. So, I think we might see in other commentaries that I think James and John had been either talking about or witnessing an opportunity that they thought that this would be the solution to bring down fire from heaven. But right away Jesus intervened and said that isn't going to happen. Have you ever felt unwelcome away from home? What was the occasion? How did you feel? I thought about this question for a while, actually. I was trying to think about the different times that I was away from home. And now, traveling in the United States, there hasn't been many times where I really have felt unwelcome. And I think typically when you travel, it doesn't matter what state you're in. I mean, obviously, if you're down south, you don't have, you don't sound like a Southerner. And so they know right away that you're not from the South, and so, but I don't ever view that as a thing where I really felt, as it says here, unwelcome. But I have traveled out of the country and somewhat extensively in Europe, and I do know that there were times. This is more than 50 years ago. I was actually stationed in Germany for a year and a half, and I do know that. Back then, maybe it's the same way today. American soldiers were not viewed as somebody that they would really wanted in their country. And I look at it as I can understand why, because most of the time you had these young 20-year-old, I'll almost refer to them as kids, who weren't necessarily, when they were off base, doing things that would really shed a good light upon the United States. And so there were times where it wasn't like it was a hostility, but I think, if they knew that you were an American soldier, you might have been treated a little differently than if you were just a tourist or they were thinking that you were from someplace else. So I'm sure all of you might have other occasions where you felt unwelcome. How did you feel? Well, many times maybe you felt uncomfortable. Whatever it might be. It just depends upon your feelings and their feelings. I will share this trip that we took to the Holy Lands. My wife was not that keen on going because she felt, things happen in the Middle East that sometimes are quite unexpected, and sometimes you're in an area where you didn't know that anything was going to occur, and all of a sudden a bomb goes off or whatever it might be. And so she was uncomfortable, not necessarily because of being unwelcome, but just because of a security issue, a danger that she might be facing if she was in the Holy Lands. And of course, we didn't experience anything at all like that. Praise God. So that takes us to question number 4. It says, read Luke 9:54 to 55. And that basically says, when the disciples James and John saw this, they asked, Lord, do you want us to call down fire from heaven to destroy them? But Jesus turned and rebuked them. And so it says, what do the contrasting attitudes reported in this passage reveal about Jesus and his 2 disciples, James and John? Well, the text once again does share a little bit about this. It says, some sense of the degree of animosity comes out in the response of James and John when he wanted to call fire down from heaven to destroy them. Jesus rebuked them rather severely, saying, you do not know what manner of spirit you are of. For the Son of Man did not come to destroy men's lives, but to save them. The fact that this attitude was troubling to Jesus gave rise very soon to an opportunity to reinforce his love for the Samaritans. And that's the next story we're going to focus on. But obviously, Jesus didn't have to think very hard to know that what they were doing was not what he wanted. Worsby indicates here, nor did the apostles love their enemies. James and John had seen the prophet Elijah on the mount. Now we're talking about what? We're talking back about when we just read earlier in this lesson here, we read about them going up and seeing Moses and Elijah on the top of the mountain. So they'd seen Elijah on the mountain, and they thought they might imitate him and call down fire from heaven. The Samaritans and Jews had been enemies for centuries, so it was understandable that that village would reject Jesus as he traveled toward Jerusalem. Jesus rebuked their vengeful spirit and simply went to another village. And then it says later Samaria would be reached with the gospel, and that doesn't happen until the book of Acts. So, as I indicated before, it's a story that I was not really all that familiar with, and it's a strange story, because why would Jesus' disciples even think anything like that? But it does prove that, we're dealing with fallible men. We're dealing with men that, we're sinners. We're dealing with fishermen, and so they had their own way of thinking, and Jesus wanted to make sure right away that they understood that this was not the way that he was going to follow, even in a territory that might contain enemies of the Jews. Now, in question 5, it says, why do you agree or disagree that racial prejudice contradicts what the Bible teaches? And I think we could probably, if we were together, we could probably discuss this at some length. Obviously, racial prejudice usually doesn't result in anything positive occurring. And so prejudice in itself is a very negative type of word. And so that would not be what the Bible would teach at all. And certainly not what Jesus was teaching, because if you recall, Luke is sharing this story that Jesus is reaching out to everyone. Jew, Gentile, it didn't matter. Poor, rich. And so, obviously, that's going to contradict what the Bible teaches. But let's take a look here at what Worsby has to say. It was expected that rabbis would discuss theological matters in public, and the question this scribe asked was one that was often debated by Jews. It was a good question asked with a bad motive. And so what we're talking about here now, if you excuse me just for a second. Question 5 is actually with the second reading that we wanted to go to, so I think we need to read that before we actually attempt to answer this. And before we're going to go into chapter 10, and I wanted to just read a passage to you that I thought was interesting. And basically, it's really what Jesus wanted his disciples to hear. But the way it starts out is what's interesting to me. In chapter 10, verse 1, it says, after this, the Lord appointed 72 others and sent them 2 by 2 ahead of him to go into every town and place where he was about to go. He told them, the harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. Ask the Lord of the harvest, therefore, to send out workers into his harvest field. Go, I am sending you out like lambs among wolves. Do not take a bag, purse, sandals, and do not greet anyone on the road. When you enter a house, first say, peace to this house. If someone who promotes peace is not there, your peace will not rest on them. If not, it will return to you. Stay there, eating and drinking whatever they give you, for the worker deserves his wages. Do not move around from house to house. When you enter a town and are welcome, eat what is offered to you. Heal the sick who are there, and tell them, the kingdom of God has come near to you. But when you enter a town and you are not welcome, go into its streets and say, even the dust of your town we wipe from our feet as a warning to you. Yet be sure of this, the kingdom of God has come near. I tell you, it will be more bearable in that day for Sodom than for that town. Now, let me just share with you what this is really all about. Because, first of all, it said, the Lord appointed 72 others. Now, I have to share with you that in many accounts that number is 70 rather than 72. And it just so happens in the NIV, it's talking about 72 others that he sent out. Who are these others? Well, these others are not the apostles that we're familiar with, the 12. No, these are some additional followers of Jesus that he sent out. So what I read earlier on had to do with the sending of the 12, and the sending of the 12 out to spread the good news. This is the second opportunity to send out people. The harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. He's sending these people out 2 by 2 through all the world, basically. And he's telling them what they should do, what they should take, what they should do if they encounter people that are willing to house them, and then what if they are not received in the town well, what they should do. And so I just wanted to share that with you because this is a different group of people that are being sent out, and that is what that particular was about. But the interesting part to me is that a lot of what he's saying to them, he said to the apostles when he sent them out, about what to take, what to do, and then to dust off your shoes, dust off your feet if you're not received well in that particular town. So there's some parallels there. However, the lesson that they wanted us to really get into is in Luke chapter 10, verses 29 to 37. And so I will read that. It says, this is talking here about defining a neighbor. A religious scholar stood up with a question to test Jesus. Teacher, what do I need to get to eternal life? What is written in the law? He replied, how do you read it? He answered, love the Lord God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your strength, and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. And Jesus answered, you have replied correctly. Do this and you will live. Now we're going to get into the story that they want us to think about. But he wanted to justify himself, so he asked Jesus, and who is my neighbor? In reply, Jesus said, a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho when he was attacked by robbers. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. A priest happened to be going down the same road, and when he saw the man, he passed by on the other side. So too, a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he traveled, came where the man was, and when he saw him, he took pity on him. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he put the man on his own donkey, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper. Look after him, he said, and when I return I will reimburse you for any extra expense you may have. Which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hand of robbers? The expert in the law replied, the one who had mercy on him. Jesus told him, go and do likewise. So, in summary, whether or not this man was trying to trap Jesus or not, he ultimately said he knew the law, and he recited the law back to Jesus. And the final part of the law was, love your neighbor as yourself. And Jesus says, you have answered correctly, do this and you will live. But the man wanted to justify himself, so he asked Jesus, who is my neighbor? What, such an important lesson here that Jesus revealed. And so we're going to talk about this for the remainder of our questions here in this particular lesson 8. So now we're on 5, and so I got ahead of myself just a bit. But Wiersbe wants to talk about that. He said, it was expected that rabbis would discuss theological matters in public, and the question this scribe asked was one that was often debated by the Jews. It was a good question, asked with a bad motive, because the lawyer hoped to trap our Lord. However, Jesus trapped the lawyer. Our Lord sent the man back to the law, not because the law saves us, but because the law shows us what we need to be saved. There can be no real conversion without conviction, and the law is what God uses to convict sinners. The scribe gave the right answer, but he would not apply it personally to himself and admit his own lack of love for both God and his neighbor. So instead of being justified by throwing himself on the mercy of God, he tried to justify himself and wriggle out of his predicament. He used the old debating tactic. Define your terms. What do you mean by neighbor? Who is my neighbor? Jesus did not say this story was a parable, so it could well be the report of an actual occurrence. For Jesus to tell a story that made the Jews look bad and the Samaritans look good would either be dangerous or self-defeating. You just made that up, they would say. We all know that nothing like that would ever happen. So it's possible that some of his listeners, including the lawyer, knew that such a thing had really happened. Either way, the account is realistic. The worst thing we can do with any parable, especially this one, is to turn it into an allegory and make everything stand for something. The victim becomes the lost sinner who is half dead, helplessly left on the road of life. The priest and Levite represent the law and the sacrifices, neither of which can save the sinner. The Samaritan is Jesus Christ, who saves the man, pays the bill, and promises to come again. The inn stands for the local church where believers are cared for, and the 2 pence are the 2 ordinances, baptism and communion. If you take this approach to Scripture, you can make the Bible say almost anything you please, and you are sure to miss the messages God wants you to get. So instead, it says, the road from Jerusalem down to Jericho was indeed a dangerous one. Since the temple workers used it so much, you would have thought the Jews or Romans would have taken steps to make it safe. It is much easier to maintain a religious system than it is to improve the neighborhood. Most of us can think up excuses for the priest and Levite as they ignored the victim. The priest had been serving God at the temple all week and was anxious to get home. Perhaps the bandits were still lurking in the vicinity and using a victim as bait. Why take a chance? Anyway, it was not his fault that the man was attacked. The road was busy, so someone else was bound to come along and help the man. The priest left it to the Levite, and then the Levite did what the priest did. Nothing. Such is the power of the bad example of a religious man. By using a Samaritan as the hero, Jesus disarmed the Jews, for the Jews and Samaritans were enemies. It was not a Jew helping a Samaritan, but a Samaritan helping a Jew who had been ignored by his fellow Jews. The Samaritan loved those who hated him, risked his own life, spent his own money, and was never publicly rewarded or honored as far as we know. I think Barclay also has something to say. First, let us look at the scene of this story. The road from Jerusalem to Jericho was a notoriously dangerous road. Jerusalem is 2,300 feet above sea level. The Dead Sea near which Jericho stood is 1,300 feet below sea level. So then, it's somewhat less than 20 miles. The road dropped 3,600 feet. It was a road of narrow, rocky defiles and of certain sudden turnings, which made it a happy hunting ground of brigands. In the 5th century, Jerome tells us that it was still called the Red or Bloody Way. In the 19th century, it was still necessary to pay safety money to the local sheiks before one could travel on it. As late as the 1930s, H.V. Morton tells us that he was warned to get home before dark if he intended to use the road, because a certain Abu Jihad was adept at holding up cars and robbing travelers and tourists and escaping to the hills before the police could arrive. When Jesus told this story, he was telling about the kind of thing that was constantly happening on the Jerusalem to Jericho road. So, that sort of is a prelude to this whole discussion here, and we're going to be talking about it in greater length as we look through the other questions. It says, read Luke 10:30, and if I look there, it says, Jesus replied, a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho when he was attacked by robbers. Now, it says, the man journeying from Jerusalem to Jericho was traveling downhill. How might this downhill course picture the human race's journey since sin entered the world? Wow. Think about a question for discussion, where you could take that. You could go off in so many different tangents and so many different routes as far as discussing this whole thing about humans' journey since sin entered the world and going downhill. So, what I would just share with you is what the text has to say, and the other commentaries, probably not completely answering the question in the way it was asked, but giving us information about this kind of thing. So, in the text itself, we're going to find a couple passages. The first one starts on page 73 if you have your book in front of you. But a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho when he fell into the hand of robbers. This road was probably the best known road to the listening audience. It drops about 3,600 feet in the 17 miles between the two cities. Apparently it was very dangerous and frequented by robbers and bandits. No surprise to the people that Jesus chose this setting for his story. Like all good robbers, another oxymoron. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him, and left him half dead. Again, no surprises. A priest happened to be going down. Oops, sorry. That'll be for the next question. So, Wiersbe can further add here, what the Samaritans did help us better understand what it means to show mercy, and it also illustrates the ministry of Jesus Christ. The Samaritan identified with the needs of the stranger and had compassion on him. There was no logical reason why he should rearrange his plans and spend his money just to help an enemy in need, but mercy does not need reasons. Being an expert in the law, the scribe certainly knew that God required his people to show mercy even to strangers and enemies. See how wisely Jesus turned the table on the lawyer, trying to evade responsibility? The man asked, "Who is my neighbor?" But Jesus asked, which of these men was neighbor to the victim? The big question is, to whom can I be a neighbor? And this has nothing to do with geography, citizenship, or race. Wherever people need us, there we can be neighbors, and like Jesus Christ, show mercy. The lawyer wanted to discuss neighbor in a general way, but Jesus forced him to consider a specific man in need. How easy it is for us to talk about abstract ideals and fail to help solve concrete problems. We can discuss things like poverty and job opportunities and yet never personally help feed a hungry family or help somebody find a job. And of course we look at Barclay here. And he says, let's look at the characters. So we're going to look at the characters in this particular story. There was the traveler. He was obviously a reckless and foolhardy character. People seldom attempted the Jerusalem to Jericho road alone if they were carrying goods or valuables. Seeking safety in numbers, they traveled in convoys or caravans. This man had no one but himself to blame for the plight in which he found himself. So that was the traveler that was accosted and robbed. And then there was the priest. He hastened past. No doubt he was remembering that he who touched the dead man was unclean for 7 days. He could be not sure but he feared the man was dead. To touch him would mean losing his turn of duty in the temple, and he refused to risk that. He set the claims of ceremonial above those of charity. The temple and its liturgy meant more to him than the pain of man. Then there was the Levite. He seemed to have gone nearer to the man before he passed on. The bandits were in the habit of using decoys. One of their number would act the part of a wounded man, and when some unsuspecting traveler stopped over him, and others would rush upon him and overpower him. The Levite was a man whose motto was safety first. He would take no risks to help anyone else. And then there was the Samaritan. The listeners would obviously expect that with his arrival, the villain had arrived. He may not have been racially a Samaritan at all. The Jews had no dealings with the Samaritans, and yes, this man seems to have been a kind of commercial traveler who was a regular visitor to the inn. In John chapter 8, the Jews called Jesus a Samaritan. The name was sometimes used to describe a man who was a heretic and a breaker of the ceremonial law. Perhaps this man was a Samaritan in the sense of being one whom all Orthodox good people despised. We know two things about this Samaritan. His credit was good. Clearly, the innkeeper was prepared to trust him. He may have been theologically unsound, but he was an honest man. And secondly, he alone was prepared to help. A heretic he may have been, but the love of God was in his heart. It is no new experience to find the Orthodox more interested in dogmas than in help, and to find the man the Orthodox despise to be the one who loves his fellow man. In the end, we will be judged not by the creed we hold, but by the life we live. Now, if we read Luke 10:31 and 32, it says, "A priest happened to be going down the same road, and when he saw the man, he passed by on the other side. So too a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side." So, how do you think organized religion sometimes fails needy sinners? Well, this once again is quite a question and something that can't be answered quickly. But organized religion sometimes can fail needy sinners. I mean, am I part of organized religion? I think I am. And if I don't do it, then God doesn't get the credit because I haven't done anything. And so I do think that, sometimes organized religion can fail needy sinners. We'll take a look at what the text shares with this. Page 74. It says, "A priest happened to be going down the same road." Of course, he is the neighbor. Certainly a priest seeing his Jewish brother lying bloody and beaten will help him. After all, that's what priests do. But he didn't even slow down. When he saw the man, he passed by on the other side. But the lawyer had an answer, we can surmise. The priest couldn't afford to make himself unclean because he was on his way to minister at the temple, or he'll pray for him at the temple today. No great surprise here. And then so too a Levite, when he came to the place. Aha, certainly this good layman is the neighbor. He's used to blood. He works in the temple assisting the priest with sacrifices. Surely he will stop and help the poor man. But surprise, surprise, the Levite merely went over and took a look at the beaten and bloody man and passed by on the other side. Now that's a surprise. If neither the priest nor the Levite would help, what hope is there for the poor man? What could Jesus possibly getting at with all of this? But a Samaritan, as he traveled, came where the man was, and when he saw him, he took pity on him. We can begin to understand the lawyer's predicament. He was suddenly caught in the web of his own conceit. One can almost see him shrinking before the gaze of the master. A Samaritan, a neighbor? They are not even persons. But watch what happened. The Samaritan went to him and bandaged his wounds. He poured in oil and wine to soothe and heal. He inconvenienced himself by putting the wounded man on his own donkey and took him to an inn and took care of him. The Samaritan saw a man in need, not a Jew. He just saw a fellow human being who was hurting, and he did what he could to help him, sharing freely of his time and resources. The next day he took out 2 silver coins, enough to pay for the man's care for up to 2 months by some estimates. He instructed the innkeeper to take care of the man and said, "When I return, I will reimburse you for any extra expenses you have." The Samaritan may have been known to the innkeeper, having traveled that way frequently, or the innkeeper may have decided anyone who shows that kind of love and compassion, Samaritan or not, is all right in my book. And we can also find a passage in Wiersbe that might apply. He says, "What the Samaritan did helps us better understand what it means to show mercy, and it also illustrates the ministry of Jesus Christ. The Samaritan identified with the needs of the stranger and had compassion on him. There was no logical reason why he should rearrange his plans and spend his money just to help an enemy in need, but mercy does not need reasons. So being an expert in the law, the scribe certainly knew what God required of his people to show mercy even to strangers and enemies." So that brings us to question number 8, which asks, what might it cost an individual or a congregation to be good Samaritans? What does it cost us? What does it cost us to show mercy and love to a fellow human being? Well, the text has a couple different passages that I just wanted to refer to. The first one's found on page 75, and it says, "But a Samaritan as he traveled came where the man was, and when he saw him he took pity on him." We can begin to understand. I'm sorry, I just read this passage before. I got ahead of myself. So the second passage is going to be over, starting on page bottom of 76. "A Samaritan took pity on him. God sent his Son in the likeness of a sinful flesh to condemn sin into the flesh. The law of the Spirit of life in Christ Jesus has made us free from the law of sin and death. He bandaged his wounds. Jesus came to him where he was wounded, lost and sinful. Humankind lay by the side of the road, took on himself the likeness of sinful humanity, yet without sin, and gave himself as a ransom, redeeming, saving, and healing us by his own precious blood. To him who loves us and has freed us from our sins by his blood. He took him to an inn and took care of him. What a blessing to be cared for by the Lord. Cast all your cares on the Lord who cares for you. And look after him." He literally paid the price. And when Jesus went away, he said, "I will not leave you comfortless. I will send another comforter to guide you into all truth." He established a church to guard and care for the flock. Jesus said, "When I return, I go to prepare a place for you, that where I am, that you may all be also." He will come again. So this passage here in this passage in the text is really referring to how Jesus really applies to all these particular things that occurred in the Good Samaritan. All those characteristics are found in Jesus Christ. We can also look at Wiersbe here, for I think he has a brief one for us to share. And he says here, "One of my favorite D.L. Moody stories illustrates this point. Attending a convention in Indianapolis, Mr. Moody asked a singer, Ira Sankey, to meet him at 6 o'clock one evening at a certain street corner. When Sankey arrived, Mr. Moody put him on a box and asked him to sing, and it was not very long before a crowd gathered. Moody spoke briefly, inviting the crowd to follow him to the nearby opera house. Before long, the auditorium was filled, and the evangelist preached the gospel to the spiritually hungry people. When the delegates to the convention started to arrive, Moody stopped preaching and said, 'Now we must close, as the brethren of the convention wish to come and discuss the question, how to reach the masses.'" Touché. We may read this passage and think only of the high cost of caring, but it is far more costly not to care. The priest and the Levite lost far more by their neglect than the Samaritan did by his concern. They lost the opportunity to become better men and good stewards of what God had given them. They could have been a good influence in a bad world, but they chose to be a bad influence. The Samaritan's one deed of mercy has inspired sacrificial ministry all over the world. Never say that such ministry is wasted. God sees to it that no act of loving service in Christ's name is ever lost. I think that's one possibly for us to consider. And that's what the question, what might it cost us to be good Samaritans? Here's this man that was a good Samaritan, and his name will be forever remembered because of the mercy that he showed to a fellow human being that had been beaten and robbed. Well, that brings us to the final question for this particular lesson, which is, why do you agree or disagree that a church should care for people in the community who are hurting not only spiritually but also physically, emotionally, and mentally? Well, you know, if we were just discussing this, honestly, isn't that what a church is for? I mean, isn't that the whole purpose of a church? To reach out into the community and help people that are spiritually, physically, emotionally, and mentally hurting? Well, let's go into the text one more time, page 75, and it starts out here. The next time you see a person hurting and in need, go to a person and take care of him or her. The next time you meet a Samaritan, say, "Hello, neighbor." That kind of love will break down the walls of animosity, hatred, and prejudice that divide. That kind of love will make us one in Christ. We can assume that James and John and the rest of the disciples also got the point. This parable broke down walls of hatred the Jews had for the Samaritans, and vice versa. Wiersbe says, "It all depends on your outlook. To the thieves, this traveling Jew was a victim to exploit, so they attacked him. To the priest and Levite, he was a nuisance to avoid, so they ignored him. But to the Samaritan, he was a neighbor to love and help, so he took care of him. What Jesus said to the lawyer, he says to us, go and keep doing it likewise." And Barclay wraps this up with, "The scribe's question, 'Who is my neighbor?' was genuine. Jesus' answer involves three things. We must help a man even when he has brought his trouble on himself, as the traveler had done. Any man of any nation who is in need is our neighbor. Our help must be as wide as the love of God. And the help that must be practical and not consist merely in feeling sorry. No doubt the priest and the Levite felt a pang of pity for the wounded man, but they did nothing. Compassion, to be real, must issue in deeds. What Jesus said to the scribe, he says to us. Go you and do the same." I would hope that that would be our motto for this particular lesson. That brings us to a conclusion, and a couple stories that we focused on today as Jesus continues his ministry. So let me just give you one reminder as we prepare for lesson number 9 next time. As always, please do the reading in advance as well as the Bible passages, and take a look at the questions, see what you have to think, because having your own answers before you hear what I have to say is quite valuable, and you might even use this question sheet as a way of jotting down some notes. So let's turn to the Lord in prayer as we conclude. Father, we've looked at a couple different stories here. One that was not that familiar to me, but here's Jesus traveling to Jerusalem through Samaria. Not the route that most people would take. Isn't that what Jesus is all about? He doesn't do what is expected. And sometimes that's the reason why people are flocking to him, to listen to him, to follow him as disciples and apostles. Isn't it why we follow him? Isn't that why we have given our lives to him? And so we also look at this whole concept today of a good Samaritan. Who is our neighbor? How, as believers in that Messiah, the Son of God, our Savior and Lord, I certainly hope that we wouldn't be the priest or the Levite. Wouldn't we help our fellow man? Wouldn't we stop and tend to him? I pray it be so. So until we gather together the next time, Father, be with us. Help us to be looking for our neighbors around every street corner, wherever it might be. There's always somebody that needs our help. And we lift this up in Jesus' name. Amen. So thank you all, and we look forward to seeing you next time.